You're listening to the Hidden Killers podcast with Tony Bruschi,
featuring attorney, guest, and former felony prosecutor Eric Faddis.
We have had our minds blown in the last couple of weeks regarding this case and potential jury tampering and the allegations against the clerk of courts. From your experience working in courtrooms all the time as an attorney, how common are allegations of jury tampering like this, especially involving an official in the court, versus some sort of influence from the outside from a defendant or something of that nature?
Yeah, this one is a little bit peculiar in the sense you just mentioned. Juror misconduct appeals are somewhat commonplace, but here we've got an allegation that the clerk of court is actively influencing the jury to convict this man. And, say what you want about Alex Murdaugh and whether you think he's guilty or not, he deserves a fair trial. Mm-hmm. And if, in fact, the clerk was doing that, I'm telling you, that could be a meritorious ground to overturn these convictions of Alex Murdaugh killing his wife and son. And that would be a monumental development in that case.
Now, when you say overturn, does that mean it would go to a new trial, or could it be, we're overturning this verdict?
In most instances, especially with this type of juror tampering alleged, it would almost always go to a new trial. Okay. Hardly ever would an appellate court say there was, what's called structural error or something that was just so grievous that they must dismiss the case. There's no chance they're doing that. We might have this whole show to watch again on the media if we have to do this trial over. And it would be a shame. And I can tell you, I used to be a clerk for a judge here in Colorado, and you'd be surprised what goes on back in those chambers that the public is not always privy to.
Obviously, I don't want to say anything to get anyone in trouble, but can you give us some idea of what you're referring to, what the public would be surprised by?
Just to be clear, that these are not examples where I believe the court did anything wrong or anything like that. Okay. But people are humans back there, man. Yeah. And, court clerks talk to one another. They say, oh, gosh, you got to come see this trial. Yeah. This defendant's lying his face off, or, this victim is making it up or whatever. And, those conversations happen. And the question in some of these critical cases is, does any of that going on affect the trial in a way that makes it so the defendant doesn't have a fair trial? That's what Alex Murdaugh's team is arguing here, that it impacted the case so severely that he has to have a new trial. Now, I haven't seen anything that egregious when I was working, but sure. There are some statements that raised some eyebrows, and I said, I don't know if you should be saying that.
Yeah. I mean, out loud is the biggest thing, because it's one thing I would understand if the clerk is saying it to another official that's not a jury member, someone who is working within that office structure and its office conversation, but has nothing to do with influencing a jury. That seems to be what one would expect to have happen in any sort of situation. But what we're talking about here is this person actively talking to the jury foreperson and making comments for others to hear about the guilt of Alex Murdaugh when not asked for it, but nor should they be saying anything at all. Does something like this just happen in a vacuum? Do you think this is just one person who's a little bit too vocal than others? We all know people that are like that. Or is this more systemic of a culture that would be going on and thriving in this courthouse, where there's just this sort of good old boy, we're going to do it the way we do it here behavior?
Yeah, I'd be interested to see it. And one thing I always tell appellate attorneys after, if a defendant sustains a conviction at trial and it's serious enough to warrant an appellate investigation, go talk to those jurors, go interview them. And in Colorado, you can do that so long as the juror consents to it, and learn what the court clerk said when they come in on breaks, when they're making the coffee in the morning. Because if there is any improper influence, whether it's understandable or human, or, that can still divest the defendant of his or her right to a fair trial. Mm-hmm. And, does this happen more often than we hear? Absolutely. Yeah. How much more often? That part's a little hard to tell.
Should there be an investigation? I mean, should this whole courthouse be looked at and take a look and see what other sort of things may or may not be going on? If this is, in fact, a culture thing. And if it is, even where we're standing right now, if Alex Murdaugh does get a new trial, should this be far away from where it took place the first time?
It certainly lends support to an argument for a change of venue, doesn't it? I mean, like you alluded to, what's going on here? And my understanding is that the clerk of court, so like the head clerk, not just like the lowly paper pusher person, but the head clerk may have had some involvement in this alleged jury influence issue. And so if I was Murdaugh's team, I would absolutely be looking into a change of venue because he's still got the financial fraud cases, not only in that same courthouse, but in front of that same judge. And presumably in front of that same judge's staff. And that's got to be ferreted out to ensure that even if he's guilty of sin, and I'm not saying he necessarily is, although he's made some confessions to the financial stuff, he still deserves a fair trial, and that has to be upheld.
This is just pure speculation, but how likely is it that Rebecca Hill was acting with no repercussions and that others had no idea that she was displaying this sort of behavior to a jury, meaning to other staff members, meaning even to the judge himself?
Yeah, it's a little hard to say because at least when I was clerking, the clerk does have some pretty special access to the jury. And there'd be many times where I would go in and check on the jury and, retrieve juror questions or make up coffee or get them lunch or whatever. And the judge wasn't always privy to those interactions. And so I just have nothing to suggest that the judge actually knew about it. And just based on my own experience, I'm wondering if that clerk kind of acted alone. Now, did the clerk share those sentiments with her coworkers, if it's true what she did? Probably, or at least it's reasonable to think she may have. So I think we might find out more about just who knew what on this issue.
If these allegations are proven true, what kind of consequences can the clerk of court, Rebecca Hill, expect?
At least in Colorado where I practice, that could potentially be grounds for jury tampering, which is a felony. That's a serious matter. But way back in the day, the famous attorney Clarence Darrow actually got popped for jury tampering and was charged with a felony. And I believe he served some jail time. But yeah, it's a serious thing, man. And and that's not even including all of the public ridicule that she would receive and the difficulty she would have in getting another job, especially in law.
You're consuming the Hidden Killers podcast.
Want more? Start binging on all of our true crime podcasts right now through Apple Podcasts and get an ad-free experience when you sign up to be a True Crime Today Premium Plus member exclusively on Apple Podcasts.
More of the Hidden Killers podcast dropping soon.
Press subscribe now.